Hello everyone, this is going to be your Unit 1 exam review video. It's going to help you review for the Unit 1 exam that you have on Monday. The district's a little bit, or wants me to administer an essay test next Friday. So I know that's a lot. It's 2 exams to have in the same week. So what I'm going to go ahead and do is I'm going to take the highest score of whichever exam that you scored highest on and enter that twice into the gradebook. So it provides you with a little bit of relief, I think, in an exam or in a week that's going to be crowded with exams. I don't offer, or I don't curve the exams. I enter the raw scores in the exams, and I know that's hard to process because it is going to be an AP style exam, but don't worry because I will certainly provide extra credit opportunities throughout the year to help make up your exam scores. Okay, so about this earlier this week, or I'm sorry, I created a YouTube video about kind of all the stuff that we talked about last week. I called a week in review video. I'm going to post week in review videos to kind of help you out and stay up to date with your AP government material that you need to know. So go ahead and check that one out if you want a more detailed explanation. But here are some vocabulary words that I introduced. These vocabulary words are not particularly relevant because they're not going to ask you, like, it's not going to be a question on the AP test or any of your unit exams, like what's a state? Like, give me the political science definition of a state, which is the monopoly on the legitimate use of force in a given territory. It's never going to ask stuff like that. But these are words that you would need to know within like questions, right? So it might ask you questions about like the legitimacy or use the term regime and stuff like that. Certainly some of the more advanced college level articles that we're going to be reading in Unit 2. We're going to be reading this very complicated article called How to Build an Autocracy in Unit 2. This is going to really help for your ability to process and understand what's being said in that article. So just make sure you know them. They're not going to be necessarily on your unit exam. Militarization of the police, that's something that we use, and that's relevant to Unit 1 being all about solving police brutality. So then I had you like kind of depart AP government and AP US history for a while. We talked about how states are not the same, how governments are not the same around the world. Some are effective, some are ineffective, some are oppressive, and that there's constant tension between the state and societies. There might be protest, even violence and rebellion, and in democracies, voting, but obviously still for the potential for violence, rebellion, and protests. Talked about this idea of social contract, this ideal that was so embedded in our founding documents that I introduced to you in the Constitution, in the Declaration of Independence. This idea of social contract, ideal social contract, really does appear. We interrogated, its significance. So at the time of the Enlightenment, when our founding fathers, or America's founding fathers, were writing the Declaration of Independence, this idea of social contract was very popular. It basically theorized that the authority of governments, the legitimacy of governments, see, I use one of those terms there, came not from God, because remember, there used to be this popular theory called divine right, but it came from the people, right? That the people a long time ago had given the king the authority to rule over them. It wasn't God giving the king authority to rule over them. That was a lie. It was the people a long time ago had done that. This theory implies this theory about the origins of government, apart from its historical inaccuracies. Take me for AP World History. It implies that people have the right to replace or overthrow it. And so it's really it's an ideal that is very much embedded in our founding documents. So we talked about how the Declaration of Independence is very much this document that said, King George III, you broke the contract. And you can see them here, colonists damaging private property, dumping tea into the harbor, etc. Here's an image of the Boston Massacre. that was probably propaganda, or is propaganda. It shows like British soldiers killing and shooting into a crowd of unarmed colonists that probably approached the British soldiers much differently. But nonetheless, American revolutionaries were very much, you broke the contract, King George III. There's just me awkwardly standing under a picture of King George III in the British Embassy with a horrible camera. So then we kind of like related these ideas to like current issues about the social contract with Black Lives Matter protesters, rioters, etc. And I played you this image of an activist kind of just talking about this idea of social contract, because I really want you to get away from this course that these themes and ideas that you're learning should be applied to politics today. But we're going to skip that for now. More potential evidence of a broken contract, and then preview what's to come. This is a great article written that kind of gets at this idea of a broken contract between American society or the American state and its people of color. We also kind of theorized whether color were even a part of this contract to begin with. The democratic ideals of the U.S. government. So these are the democratic ideals of the U.S. government that we found in the foundational documents. These natural rights, popular sovereignty, social contract. A lot of them stem from this theory of social contract. Like you really can't have natural rights unless you kind of embrace John Locke's theory of social contract. Popular sovereignty is this idea that government is created by and subject to the will of the people. So very much like this contract element. Then you looked at the Declaration of Independence. You identified these elements and themes in the social contract. Or the elements and themes, I'm sorry, you identified these democratic ideals in the Declaration of Independence. So you can see this idea that King George, the contract, that all men are created equal, they're endowed by the Creator. Those are very much natural rights. Natural rights is this idea that was popular during the Enlightenment, but actually goes all the way back to Thomas Aquinas. And we'll see this again. This is stuff you don't have to know, but we'll see it again in when we read Martin Luther King's letter from a Birmingham jail. This idea that God gives us rights that are inviolable. You can't violate them. Yeah, I think I said that right. You can't violate them. Right, this idea that God gave us these unalienable rights as human beings, and Thomas Jefferson articulates in the Constitution life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. He borrowed that from John Locke, a social contract theorist that said life, liberty, and property. This idea of popular sovereignty, right of the people are the ones that create government. They're the ones that government should be responsible to. That was not always the case in AP world history. And then, of course, this idea of social contract. So kind of connecting this homework that I assigned to you, I think this was the only really homework that you've had. This homework was really just supposed to get you like a distilled down version of AP US history, kind of review some of what happened at AP US history. You're presented with a argument by Hannah Nicole Jones about the exclusion of people of color from the social contract. She suggests that Black people are the ones that allowed the United States to live up to its ideals. So this doesn't go away, right? So everything that we learn in this class is super, super connected, and I'm trying to connect it as much as possible. So make sure that you are mindful of that. We talked about types of democracy. We said that our government is a representative democracy, which is a system where citizens of the country vote for government representatives to handle legislation and rule the country on their behalf. We said that representative democracies can take various forms: participatory, pluralist, and elite democracy. But those forms don't necessarily, but our system kind of combines all three. And some elite democracy has a negative connotation, but some of us, upon further interrogation, kind of like some aspects of elite democracy in our system. Some of us on further interrogation like some aspects of pluralist democracy, like some aspects of participatory, don't like other aspects of participatory. So complicated, complex, as Mrs. Smith says. So participatory emphasized broad participation in politics and civil society by people at various levels of the socioeconomic status. So I discussed this idea of referendums. So referendums are obviously in a nation of 330 million people, it's really impossible for all 330 million of us to vote on every single issue, right? We need representatives to do that for us. It's like logistically impossible. But there are some issues that are turned over to the people. For example, Colorado issued a referendum on marijuana legalization. Basically, people got to vote on whether they wanted to legalize marijuana in the state or not. People voted to legalize marijuana, so marijuana was legal in the state of Colorado. So that's an example of participatory democracy. The fact that referendums are even a thing is an example of participatory democracy. Maybe we like it, maybe we don't. We might not like it if we're kind of elitist and we say, well, maybe the most uneducated shouldn't get a say. Maybe we should have our representatives who are super educated. I don't necessarily agree with this position, but they are the ones that should legislate on our behalf. Pluralist implies organized group-based activism by people with common interests, all striving for the same political goals. So this is very much, we'll discuss this more when we get to Federalist No. 10, where Madison talks about the importance of a big republic or at least not having a lot of power in localized governments because of factions. And so it's this idea that people are going to ally with groups of their same interests, and they're going to fight to they have to fight other interest groups, other competing groups, and then legislation gets done that way. So Madison, very much in Federalist No. 10, likes the conflictual nature of this system. He enjoys the conflictual nature of this system because it implies that legislation is not hurried, that laws are not hurried, that there's this process, and through that conflict there might emerge compromise. Democracy is this complicated mechanism. Madison likes this complication. There are some critics, hint, that suggest that pluralist democracy sounds good in theory, but in practice, it's really just for the elites again. It's just another version of elite democracy. It's a myth. Because the people that have the ability to organize, the people that have the ability to influence legislation, they already have the most resources to begin with, right? And so it may just be like a way to avoid saying elite democracy, but it may just be elite. For example, you can imagine interest groups, or we'll talk about interest groups in the next slide. So let's just hold it for a moment. Elite democracy is those elements that discourage participation by the majority of citizens and cedes power, so it gives power to the educated and or wealthy. So this is an example of participatory democracy. Very much grassroots protests are always participatory democracy. Emphasize broad participation in politics and civil society. Pluralists would be stuff like interest groups, like unions, like teachers unions, police unions that go on strike to try to get better wages or try to influence policy, influence the government. Also, interest groups like the National Rifle Association. So these are examples of interest groups, which are a band of people that band together, all for the common purpose of protecting, in their view, gun rights. Some critics of the National Rifle Association would just say, okay, yeah, the National Rifle Association, yeah, it has like bands and members within the National Rifle Association that are from all across the country. So like pluralist democracy is beautiful. It's not elite democracy. At the same time, too, like major corporations, fund or love the National Rifle Association because it allows them to get more gun sales, right? That can be like an interpretation or critique of the National Rifle Association, so to speak, and a suggestion that this facade of like there's all these competing groups in our democracy that are competing, and that's how legislation gets done, is that they fight and then eventually compromise is reached or legislation is achieved, that people from all walks of life can align with different interest groups. Yeah, that's true, but at the same time too, who has the power to really start these interest groups? Who has the power to really fund these interest groups? Yeah, some of it may come from like everyday people, but does it always come from everyday people? So that's some of the critiques about pluralist democracy. Keep that in mind. We talked about police unions, and then elite democracy. I just wanted to present like an aspect that we might like. We talked about Harvard Law School producing so many presidents or so many people in politics. And some of us said, okay, well, I want my president to go to Harvard Law, or I want my congressman to know a lot about law and to go to one of the best law schools in the country. So yeah. Other of us disagreed with this, and we said, I personally disagree with this. I think that there are a lot of great institutions all around the world. I think the fact that I think there's no person on the Supreme Court that hasn't either been to Harvard or Yale Law School, only those two schools. I think there's a lot of other good law schools as well that are public too. We went through examples of like elite democracy. So this is an example of participatory democracy, like the kind of elements of participatory democracy. This is an example of participatory democracy, like the protesters seem to be organic. Could be an example of elite democracy in the fact that Louis DeJoy is accused of trying to sabotage and deny the most amount of people the ability to vote in the next election if we think that claim is true. Then we discussed the Articles of Confederation, the weaknesses of the Articles of Confederation. We said that this is the in-between document between the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. Articles of Confederation is basically a document, and remember that a lot of people very much feared putting too much power in the national government because of the fact that the national government, or they had just broken away from what was perceived to be a national government that was very intrusive and tyrannical in American colonists' lives. So we talked about the weaknesses of the Articles of Confederation. You have to know this. Please, hint, hint. Weaknesses of the AOC were that there was not a very strong central government. There was no executive branch, so there was no president of the United States. The legislature was a unicameral branch. That's not necessarily a weakness. That's just a fact. There was no direct taxation of people. Remember, they had complained in the American Revolution about no taxation without representation, no way to raise or maintain standing army, no national court system, no national currency. So the way that you can think of the Articles of Confederation is like basically being like America was in this time period very much like very distinct, separate countries that were loosely tied together by this document, the Articles of Confederation, very loosely tied together by this document. They all had, or not all of them, but a lot of them had different types of money. They didn't have common currency. They didn't have a common standing military, etc. A lot of stuff. So yeah, but it did have a legacy of like establishing this practice of this sharing of power between national and local governments that is very much embedded in our system. But yeah, so a lot of stuff that we take for granted now, like White House, I just had an image of, I thought this was a good image, but I guess not, but like of Channing Tatum like blowing up the White House because there was no president, there was no national currency, there were several different types of currencies at its hand, and there was no national military. So Shays' Rebellion, to a lot of historians' minds, really kind of highlights the weaknesses of the Articles of Confederation. As a group of farmers that were mad about an economic crisis that had gripped the country. They were losing farms to foreclosure and failure to pay taxes. Shay asked for the government to print more money, lighten taxes. They instituted an armed rebellion, and it took forever to put them down. Eventually, they were put down when a group of wealthy people paid to have the rebellion to put down. So this made leaders realize the need for a stronger federal government. So a lot of radical historians interpret the putting down of Shays' Rebellion as basically, and then like the Constitutional Convention that meets in 1787, as basically a bunch of rich people getting together and saying, okay, we have to find a way to make sure the peasants don't revolt again. But most historians say that the people that actually convened at the Constitutional Convention were pragmatists. They were practical people. They just wanted a better functioning government. They were pragmatists. They weren't this elite conspiring to put down poor people. I don't know. So in 1787, or I shouldn't just do I don't know, because I'm not a historian, so I need to read the historical scholarship before I get a better picture and understanding of what that looks like. But I think we'll stick with this narrative. So in 1787, the Constitutional Convention convened. They only wanted to modify the Articles of Confederation. They did not want to change it significantly, just to modify it. The delegates agreed a stronger national government was necessary, but fearful of the corrupting influence of power. So the draft of the Constitution submitted to the states for ratification, or they eventually decided just to make a whole new constitution. They submitted a draft of the Constitution for the states for ratification, and then two camps of people came up: the Federalists who supported the Constitution and the Anti-Federalists who opposed the creation of a stronger national government in the Constitution, arguing the Constitution would threaten citizens' personal liberties and effectively make the president a king. Very much fearful. Then we talked about like modern expansion of government power in today's politics, or expansion of presidential power in today's politics. And we'll talk more about that when we get into the authoritarianism unit. But then we were presented with like the anti-federalist argument articulated by Brutus No. who was likely David Yates, or who was David Yates. He was an anti-federalist. He kickstarted this series of papers called the Federalist Papers, which were basically a series of publications that argued for and against the Constitution as proposed. So in Brutus No. 1, the anonymous author posed a series of questions about and critiques of the then proposed Constitution. Many critiques included that the proposed national government had too much power, a standing army could diminish liberty, and that representatives would not truly represent the people. So he wanted more power in local governments, more power in state governments, etc., than more power in a central government. He objected to the idea of a standing army. He objected to the idea of a singular president on the grounds that that president could eventually turn into a king. And he objected to this idea of a big republic, because he said then if and remember, the Republic then was only about 3 million people. Now it's 330 million. He said that there's no way the interests of everyone will be able to be recognized in this type of republican representative democracy. Remember that Brutus was one of the senators that stabbed Julius Caesar. So Julius Caesar was basically turned himself into the emperor of Rome, and was consolidating power and becoming a dictator. And Julius Caesar was the one that stabbed. Or Brutus was the one that stabbed, one of the senators that stabbed Julius Caesar to prevent him from becoming a dictator. And then this line from Mean Girls: we should totally just stab Caesar, because she's like projecting onto because they're reading Julius Caesar in the movie, and she's projecting her anger at Regina George into the literature. Literature is important, guys. Yeah, and then we watched the DHS video. We said that, okay, we see elements of what Brutus was talking about, etc. Some of us didn't. Yeah. Federalist No. 10 very much responds to Brutus No. 1. It's James Madison's response to Brutus No. 1. And he says, hey, you know what? A big republic is good, because then you have different types of factions, right? And these different types of factions can fight out each other, right? And they can avoid tyranny, right? Because in a very localized government, very localized environment, people have more power over their government. And the more power they have over the government, the more likely they are going to tyrannize someone else, because people are self-interested, petty, disgusting individuals. So you want all this conflict in a republic, because humans are not angels. So you want tons of conflict. You want a bigger republic so it can dilute or reduce the power of individuals. And the more power you reserve to localities, the more power people have, and the more tyranny there's going to be. Right? So he likes this idea of factionalism. So Madison very much endorses this idea of a pluralist democracy. Brutus No. 1 very much endorses this idea of a participatory democracy. This was Remember, we kept in mind that Madison was talking about tyranny of minority groups, but excluded from this contract was people of color. They were very much not included within Madison's idea of government and who government should serve, right? So this complicates our understanding a bit, but this is going to become super, super important as we go into Unit 2 and Unit 3 as well. Then we did the Ruby Bridges example. We said that this was an example of a federal government that was strong and powerful and had a national federal government that had effectively diluted the power of the tyrannical power of the local Louisiana government, who, if they had it their way, would have had tyranny over and decision-making power over Ruby Bridges' ability to integrate a school. We also talked about partisanship, however. We complicated this picture further, and we said that in modern politics, Madison had a vision of a democracy that was always perpetually at conflict, that there would be so many factions and so many different interest groups. And we also talked about this idea that maybe there really isn't a lot of different factions and interest groups. Maybe there's only two. And then we talked about this idea of getting both sides ided, and both sides ism, where we're told we have to look at the other side, we have to be conciliatory to the other side, we have to certainly think about other people's perspectives, and other people, we always mean the other side, and that there's some ground in the middle. But we also kind of recognize that this kind of reduces the complexity of living in a country of 330 million people. Actually, Washington, and this is an important point that you probably need to know for the test, Washington articulated in his farewell address, he was the first president of the United States. He assumed power under the Constitution, didn't assume power under the Articles of Confederation, articulated that political parties could be extraordinarily detrimental and harmful to society. Political parties can be extraordinarily detrimental and harmful to society. And the fact that we only have two, it boggles it. It boggles my mind, because it suggests that people in Idaho, for instance, that are likely to vote Republican are going to, and people from Mississippi that are likely to vote for Republican, if you asked them, they would probably have the same interests and values checked off, right? And same priorities and stuff that they want in a federal government checked off. The reason for this is probably the rise of mass media. So maybe they're both in both parts of the country, they're both watching Fox News, right? And so this probably suggests that this complicated republic of tons of different factions competing to get legislation done, maybe it's not so complicated after all. And I think there's probably, Madison would look at the rise of two political parties, and only two political parties, would look at where we are in today's politics and might say, hey, idiots, you got the factions thing wrong. There's only two in this country. There needs to be a lot more. Maybe, maybe not. Okay, so then we talked about this idea of a thesis statement. We'll talk more about that later. First PowerPoint done. Second PowerPoint. Okay, so the second PowerPoint, I introduced this problem of authoritarianism, which we're going to work a lot with on Unit 2. I'm super, super excited. We're going to start reading how to build an autocracy. It's a super controversial piece, so I hope that you're there for it, regardless of who you support. We are supposed to interrogate in this class controversial material and be able to engage with controversial material. So we are definitely going to kick off Unit 2 controversially, but we have to finish Unit 1 too as well. So we're going to finish Unit 1 next week. We're going to watch the documentary Policing the Police by Frontline PBS. You're going to articulate your policy proposal, and then you're going to have your last unit exam next Friday. I know it feels like we haven't been talking about Unit 1 for very long, or we haven't been talking about police brutality for very long. Well, you know, online distance learning moves fast. So we talked about this. This is not going to actually be on the test, but just know that the suggested implicit in this, by introducing these two words, is that the United States has several different practices. several different examples of authoritarian and illiberal practices historically, and that they can still exist now, right? These practices are probably being carried out now. And so it helps us get away from this image that authoritarian just means Hitler's Nazi Germany. Authoritarian and illiberal can be practices, like patterns of action that still can exist within a democracy themselves. So further complicating our ideas and perspectives. So we talked about the Constitutional Convention itself. We talked about the Great Compromise. This is important to know. You have to know about the compromises that I'm going to enumerate in a bit. Where the Great Compromise started off, there were small states and big states that were proposing at the Constitutional Convention in 1787, as they were drafting the Constitution, two houses of government. The small states in the New Jersey plan wanted a unicameral legislature. They wanted a unicameral legislature that had equal representation in Congress. Equal representation in Congress. So every state, no matter the size, would have two representatives that would pass laws for them. The bigger states, the ones with larger population, were like, wait, that's not fair because we have more people. So I want two-house legislature. I want a bicameral legislature where representation is based on population. Of course, there was a compromise between the states, and we've been living with the effects of that compromise ever since. There was two-house legislature created, a bicameral legislature with representation in the upper house of Congress, called the Senate, and representation of the lower house of Congress, proportional to population. So this has had a profound effect because what this means in today's politics is that states like Oklahoma, I'm not sure about the population of Oklahoma, but it's definitely within 1 million, under 1 million people, have the same amount of senators as states like California, right? California, which is a population of 70 million people. So the electoral, or I'm sorry, the bicameral legislature, the way it's structured today, it disproportionately favors white rural voters in the Senate, right? Because you have a lot, like states like Oklahoma, Kansas, white rural voters are disproportionately represented in the Senate. And so what that means is, like, the House of Representatives has a bunch of Democrats in the House of Representatives right now. In the last midterm elections, the Republicans face a series of losses, but the Senate is still controlled by Republicans, and conceivably in the future, the Senate strongly favors Republicans. If you're a Republican, you might think this is good. If you're a Democrat, you might think this is bad. Regardless of that, but that's just the facts of our democracy, right? So this compromise so long ago has had an after effect on the way our government is run. And so, of course, to get laws passed, you needed to pass the House of Representatives, you needed to pass the Senate. That is especially more difficult if you want to see a lot of change, especially change regarding our social problems. If the Senate is controlled by Republicans and the House is controlled by Democrats, like two different parties that we'll discuss more in Unit 4, have become further apart on their views on politics. Right, and so this is an example too, like the idea that the House of Representatives could impeach the president and that the Senate could come to a conclusion that is completely different, right? Because all Republicans in the Senate said that President Trump did not commit obstruction of justice and what was the other, or high crimes for trying to solicit or trying to get Ukraine, it seemed, and I'm not going to get into the facts of the case yet, but the fact that two different houses can come to different conclusions on whether Trump committed high crimes and misdemeanors, it's crazy, right? I mean, it suggests that there's something deeply wrong with our system, where one house of Congress seems pretty convinced that Trump needs to leave office and needs to be removed from office, and the other house, or the other chamber of Congress says no. So this suggests two things. It suggests that the Great Compromise still has an effect on our politics today, and it suggests that partisanship meaning loyalty to a political party, or even extreme loyalty to a political party, plays a major role in our politics today. And remember, George Washington would warn against partisanship. He did not like political parties. He did not like this idea of Americans pledging loyalty to political parties. Anyways, the Three-Fifths Compromise was another compromise that was reached where states in the North and South could not agree on how slaves would be counted in the population, because remember, slavery was a thing. So in a weird agreement, the slave-owning states in the South wanted slaves to count as people so they can get more representation. So in the states that were denying them rights, denying them liberty, denying them so many of the ideals embedded in our Constitution and Declaration of Independence, they were the ones that wanted them to count sort of as people, so that way they can get more representation in the House and or in the legislature. So the Three-Fifths Compromise was reached where slaves would count as 3/5 of the people. The immediate effect of this was that slave-owning states got more representation in the House of Representatives. Not the Senate, remember, they got more representation in the House of Representatives where population was allocated by, or the number of representatives was allocated by proportion to, or by population. We also talked about the Electoral College being one of those compromises that's being emblematic of an elite democracy, because it's this idea that the founders didn't want people to vote on the president directly. There's 538 electors that are the number of representatives of a state plus the number of senators. Combined, that equals the number of electors to the state. If you win the majority of the state, you win all the electors, and all the electors, in theory, you're voting for the elector who pledges to vote for the candidate. The Electoral College was also built as sort of a safeguard to prevent demagogues or people from gaining power. There's a lot of controversy regarding the Electoral College. Just review this slide as well. Some people think the Electoral College is really dumb. Other countries and other systems are confused by our electoral system, why we even have an Electoral College. And so we said that it is possible in the United States, as Hillary Clinton did in 2016, to win the popular vote significantly, but lose the Electoral College significantly, as Donald Trump won the Electoral College. This also happened in 2000 with Al Gore and Bush. So we also discussed this Federalist and Anti-Federalist arguments. Anti-Federalists are very pro, they wanted rights embedded in the Constitution that was proposed. And so as they were duking it out, disagreeing in publications, throwing shade at each other in these series of Federalist and Anti-Federalist papers, a compromise was reached. The Federalists agreed that after the Constitution was ratified by the states, that they would agree to amend the Constitution and put a Bill of Rights for the people into the Constitution. So the Bill of Rights is very much an Anti-Federalist inspired document. So the Bill of Rights are the first 10 amendments to the Constitution. They're added on to the Constitution. As you can see here, these are probably some of the most important amendments to the Constitution that are added on. We've discussed about instances where you saw all kinds of videos, or you should have seen, where these kind of rights seemed to be violated by the state. I would say that the Bill of Rights is an important amendment to important amendments to the Constitution, important Anti-Federalist inspired amendments to the Constitution that the Federalists just didn't consider, which is kind of odd, because I think they thought that the role of the federal government would be restricted naturally by factions. Then we talked about the concept of separation of powers and checks and balances. You all have like a pretty good idea of what this means from what you learned about in AP US history. So this is super important. Separation of powers, checks and balances. We talked about separation of powers within the context of, hold on, I got a message. Okay, so we talked about separation of powers as basically being this idea that government should should be distinct, right? So there should be distinct roles. And so in our system of government, Congress makes laws. The president is the one that enforces the laws, and then the judicial branch is the one that interprets the laws. And so the idea behind having separate branches of government that do different things is this idea of efficiency. And also, importantly, this idea that it will reduce the probability that tyrannical government can come into being. And so this idea of efficiency is like the same way that you don't want Mr. Diaz teaching AP biology or teaching AP statistics, because I probably wouldn't be as good as Ms. Flores and Mr. Rivas. It's this idea that I'm specialized in AP government. Like I learned about political science, I learned about international relations, right? So that means that if all the president has to do is enforce laws, he's going to be good at that. If all Congress has to do is make laws, they're going to be good at that. And if all the judicial branch has to do is interpret laws, they're going to be good at that. Also, it's also kind of like a stay in your lane type politics, right? If the president doesn't have the ability to make laws, that's good, right? I don't want the president having the ability to make laws, is the thinking that goes, right? I just want him to enforce them. Or I don't want Congress to have the ability to interpret the laws themselves. I want the judicial branch to do it, right? So it's kind of like this, it's a safeguard against tyranny as well. Checks and balances is another constitutional safeguard designed to prevent any one branch from becoming dominant. So the system of checks and balances requires the different branches of government to share power and cooperate with one another to accompany anything of importance. So this idea is that there is overlap, right? They're not just distinctly separate spheres. For example, although Congress has the ability to make laws, the president can veto those laws. The president has the ability to veto that legislation, and Congress has to come back with, I think, 2/3 and to override the veto, right? Although the president has the ability to enforce laws, Congress has the ability to investigate him, right? Although an example of a check on the legislative branch by the judicial branch is that in 1803, we'll discuss the Supreme Court case Marbury versus Madison. The judicial branch doesn't have only the ability to interpret what the laws mean. They have the ability to say that law is unconstitutional. It's a violation of the Constitution. It does not stand. It can't exist. So those are important checks and balances that we'll talk more about in the next slide. So make sure that you know these. So Congress can write laws, the president, for example, conducts foreign policy. He's the one that conducts foreign policy, but his cabinet officials, like the Secretary of State, who's supposed to engage with relations with other countries, he has to be confirmed by the Senate. So Mike Pompeo had to go through a Senate confirmation process. All of the people that the president appoints on the cabinet, like the Secretary of Education, they have to be confirmed by the Senate. So that's another example of a checks and balances. The executive branch also appoints judges, right? So it appoints Supreme Court judges. It nominates Supreme Court judges. The president nominates Supreme Court justice, but they have to be confirmed by the Senate. So it's all these kind of instances of checks and balances that prevent one branch from getting too much power. At least that's how the thinking went. The legislative branch may reject appointments, may reject treaties. So the executive branch can make treaties with other countries, but the Senate and the legislative branch has to ratify those treaties. Otherwise, it's not a treaty, right? So there's all these checks embedded in our government that is just designed to reduce tyranny from gaining a foothold. Whether they're effective or not, we will learn more about in Unit 2 to keep you in suspense. In Marbury versus Madison, so this is an important Supreme Court case. First, I would go back to the other slide to make sure that I kind of know, for the most part, all those different kind of checks and balances and powers that are embedded, that each branch has. In Marbury versus Madison was an 1803 Supreme Court case that announced for the first time the principle that a court may declare an act of Congress void if it is inconsistent with the Constitution. So this gives the Supreme Court not unlimited power, but I put it in there for all you Star Wars nerds, but much more power, much more power, right? So I'm not going to go into the facts of the case because it's super complicated, but I included a link in the description if you want to know about the facts of the case and how the Supreme Court managed to basically say that they had this power that didn't really exist in the Constitution and has has been operating with this power ever since. But they can say, like, if Congress passes a law, the Supreme Court could just say, okay, that's unconstitutional. Sorry, buddy, doesn't exist as a law. Supreme Court's a very powerful branch. We talked about threats to limited government. So the president is only one person, and the president has access to a lot of information, like the CIA, because the CIA is an executive branch agency, the FBI, etc. And they're only one person, and they can staff the White House with people loyal to them. So presidential secrecy is probably a threat to limited government. When all three branches of government agree that there's a threat to national security, they may be able to get away with violating the Constitution, which we'll talk about when we talk about Japanese internment. And then partisanship, again, a thing that George Washington hated. Why do we have only two political parties? Strong and sometimes blind adherence to a particular political party, faction, cause, or person. We'll talk about this a lot in Unit 2. Like, it is crazy because some of y'all are Republicans and Democrats, and I can see it because the videos I show you guys, y'all seeing two different things. Y'all live in two different ecosystems, right? So we have to find a way, like, how can we sever our ties with our identified political parties or what have you, and make sure that we're analyzing things in a rigorous and intellectual way, not a partisan way. This is an excerpt from Federalist 51, which was articulated by James Madison. You can just remember this quote: ambition is made to counteract ambition. So he's very much saying this system of government, this system of checks and balances, it's beautiful. It's made to, ambition is made to counteract ambition. This is how we avoid tyranny, that government, we're not angels. People are fallible. Probably people that want political power don't just want to help people. Maybe they just want to be seen and heard, and they want all the popularity that comes with it. They want the crowd sizes. So we need checks and balances in our system because ambition is made to counteract ambition. All right, this is a really cool excerpt that articulates the thinking behind why checks and balances are embedded in our system of government. Then we went through case studies where checks and balances didn't work and kind of worked and worked. So this was a case study where checks and balances didn't work. Worked pretty well and kind of worked, but partisanship got in the way. Went through a game where you all explored the Constitution. Article 1 establishes legislative branch, executive branch, judicial branch. So we went to Avalon. Okay. Then we talked about this idea. For some reason, your test is so heavy on federalism, it's freaking ridiculous. It is the most ridiculous thing I've ever seen in my life, because federalism is not even something that is heavily talked about, but your test is so heavily on federalism. But the term federalism, don't get it confused with this idea of Federalists and Anti-Federalists in that debate. Don't get it confused. Federalism isn't exclusively attached to Federalists, right? Anti-Federalists and Federalists can have different opinions about federalism, and both probably endorse the importance of federalism, but different types. So it describes a system of government under which the national government and local governments share powers. I asked you guys in the pair deck, why might this be good? Why might this be problematic? Y'all are natural geniuses, so you came up with the right answer. So it might be good because you have, more local control. So you have what Brutus number 1 would say. You have, more local control and more participatory democracy. So people able to participate in the government to get their interests heard at the more local level, and that's important, right? But you have also inequalities baked into it. So this is an example of spending per student by school district. So you can see this spending is very different across the country. They're not uniform. And right, so you can imagine, you can expect like this spending in, I guess this is Tennessee? Yeah, Tennessee being significantly smaller than spending in New York, right? And if we just use this number as like a proxy for good education, maybe the kids in Tennessee are going to be really dumb now, because education is something that is run by states, by individual states and by local governments, etc. And so we can, as opposed to being run by the federal government. So if there's maybe a federal standard about how much spending should be made per student, maybe our schools would look the same. So federalism can produce all these kinds of inequalities. We also discuss federalism within the context of police departments. Police departments look different across the country. That's what makes reforming them, at least at the national level, so difficult, because there are about 18,000 police departments. And so we also said that our debate about policing in America, where all of us have all these passionate opinions about, we've been talking about police in general as if there's the same culture within every police department, within every 18 police department, or 18,000 police departments. Same culture probably doesn't exist, right? There's probably some police departments that are flagrantly racist, probably some police departments that did a really good job at reform efforts and do a really good job generally at protecting civil rights and civil liberties. Then we talked about powers under federalism. Different powers, you have to know these. Enumerated powers are powers that are enumerated to different groups under federalism. So the power to declare, or that are enumerated to the federal government. So the power to declare war, maintain armed forces, regulate interstate and foreign trade, admit new states, establish post office, set standard weights and measures, coin money. That's all given to the federal government within the Constitution. Concurrent powers are powers that the states and federal governments share. So maintain law and order. There's an FBI that's a federal government. And then, of course, there are state and local police departments. Levy taxes, borrow money, charter banks, establish courts, provide for public welfare. Those are all concurrent powers. And then reserved powers are powers meant to be reserved to the states. So establish and maintain schools, establish local governments, regulate business within the state, make marriage laws, provide for public safety, assume other powers not delegated to national government or prohibit to the states, are reserved to the states. What complicates this picture further is like historical developments in federalism. So for example, powers that are enumerated, the reason why they're called enumerated is because it has the root word a number, Avalon project. So let me just show you really quickly. So in Article 1, Section 8, these are powers of Congress that Congress explicitly enumerates, right? So gives order to. Clause 18 says to make all laws which shall be necessary and proper for carrying into execution the foregoing powers and all powers vested by the Constitution of the government of the United States or in any other department of the office or therefore. So this says that Congress can actually, whatever is going to help you with all these powers and responsibilities you have, you can make that law. That's your responsibility. So it gives the federal government a lot of power. And then this one too, Clause 3, to regulate commerce with foreign nations and among the several states and with the Indian tribes. This has been cited by the federal government to and has allowed the federal government to gain more and more power as the years have gone by. And so, for example, regulating commerce across states is a very broad power that the federal government has interpreted as giving it broad authority to do things. So, for example, marijuana legalization in the state of Colorado that we just talked about earlier. The federal government said, I'm still going to enforce drug laws. I'm still going to arrest people that are selling weed in Colorado because the weed sold in Colorado is an interstate issue. Like, you can't just expect that weed not to go across state lines. You can't expect it not to end up in California or in Texas or whatever. And I have the authority under Clause 3 to regulate commerce with not only foreign nations, but among the several states. So they've used the Commerce Clause, like basically to give them a lot of power to do stuff that affects our lives. And the government power, federal government power, has increased dramatically over the years, but there was some pushback in the 90s, which we'll talk about in a bit. So these are the clauses of government that you can see right here. This is the Commerce Clause. You just have to know what the Commerce Clause is. To regulate commerce with foreign nations, several states, and with Indian tribes. I'll include a YouTube video in the description below on how the federal government has cited the Commerce Clause to expand its powers dramatically. The Necessary and Proper Clause is Clause 18, to make all laws which shall be necessary and proper for carrying into execution the foregoing powers. And then Article 5, Section 2 of the U.S. Constitution is known as the Supremacy Clause. The Supremacy Clause also basically says that it says that the Constitution, and it says like the federal government laws will be supreme to state government laws. So if they ever come into conflict with one another, federal government laws are deferred to. So these three bolded things give the federal government a lot of power. So the necessary and proper clause, which I just cited to you, says to make all laws which shall be necessary and proper for carrying to execution the foregoing powers. The federal government, if it's not enumerated, like they can do things that allows them to be more effective at those powers listed, right? So it gives them a lot of ability and leeway. So these clauses historically have allowed for a dramatic expansion of federal government power and ability to influence our lives, which could be good or bad, right? A lot of you are like, oh my God. But then at the same time too, I mean, idea public schools takes a lot of federal money. To regulate commerce with foreign several states and with the Indian tribes, yeah. The 10th Amendment, which remember is an anti-federalist invention, so to speak, that is attached to the original Federalist invention. And anti-federalists are very much in favor of states and local power rights, it seems. The 10th Amendment says the powers not delegated to the U.S. by the Constitution nor prohibited by its states are reserved to the states respectively or to the people. I mean, these amendments are very broad. The language of the Constitution is very broad, and that's why the judicial branch is so powerful, because they can interpret it in different ways, and they might do stuff in ways that is motivated politically by their beliefs. The 10th Amendment is very vague, but it reaffirms this idea that the federal government is limited with enumerated powers. And in the 90s, the judicial branch saw a lot of expansion of federal government power, and they cited the 10th Amendment to kind of curtail federal government power, which we'll talk about that in a bit. But I actually want to go back, if possible, and talk about concurrent powers. And so another example of like the federal government gaining more and more power is like in powers reserved to the state. Those are powers that are not enumerated by the Constitution. It says that those that are not enumerated by the Constitution, they go to the states, right? If they're not in that numbered list, it goes to the states. Well, education is one of them. But how does the federal government have a Department of Education? Well, the federal government has a Department of Education, although they can't necessarily tell school districts what to do, because their state curriculum is so different. And that's interesting too, because like textbooks in California are completely different from textbooks in Texas, right? So schooling is very political, despite what some people might say. But what the Department of Education does is they often offer incentives, right? That's all they can do. So like a federal government might offer incentives. So they provide grants to, like, for example, Idea Public School District. But the federal government might provide conditional grants, meaning I'll give you this money, but you kind of have to change your policies a bit to get this money. And the federal government has a lot of power. They have a lot of taxing power. And so that's the way they're able to influence schooling and education, even though schools are supposed to be maintained and established by the states. So this is an even more complicated picture. So these are Supreme Court rulings. Remember, the judicial branch is supposed to interpret laws. So in McCulloch versus Maryland, the court ruled that the states did not have the power to tax the national bank, and by extension, the federal government. This decision reinforced the supremacy clause of the Constitution. In Gibbons versus Ogden, the court ruled that the state of New York could not grant a steamship company monopoly to operate on an interstate waterway, because remember, the federal government is supposed to regulate interstate commerce, even though that waterway ran through New York. The ruling increased federal power over interstate commerce by implying that anything concerning interstate trade could potentially be regulated by the federal government. In U.S. versus Lopez, this was recently in the 90s, preserved the system of federalism, which delegates certain powers to states and certain powers to the federal government. It upheld the principles that states have control of local issues like gun possession on school grounds. So this is actually really fascinating, because this is the Supreme Court's recent pushback in the 1990s to push back against judicial interpretations throughout history that had basically slowly been extending state power by suggesting that the supremacy clause in the Constitution meant that if a state law contradicts federal government power, federal government law takes precedent, isn't most important. These judicial decisions have slowly been increasing state power, This is an example of basically the judicial branch kind of saying, okay, we're going to try to give a little bit more power to the states because we've just been seeing centuries of this increase in power. And so that's why president's nominations of Supreme Court justice with different ideological beliefs on the Constitution, because remember, it's only a 5,000-word document that governs so much, governs our system of government. 5,000 words is like 20 pages doublespace, which is a lot, but not a lot. That means there's a lot of room for interpretation, and the judicial branch is super powerful, even though it's the branch of government that so few of you know little about. They are very powerful. They can interpret laws in different ways. That means that President Trump's nominees for the Supreme Court certainly do matter, and they're going to have a lasting impact on this country years after President Trump is gone, because they have lifetime appointments, as with all of President Obama's nominees to the Supreme Court as well, and whoever's president next year. But I'll include a link in the description on the U.S. versus Lopez decision, but it basically says that the facts of the case was this boy brought a gun to school, and he was charged for bringing the gun to school under state laws. Obviously, it was super wrong, but then they dropped the state law charges and they replaced it with federal law charges because supposedly those were supposed to be supreme. That was the idea and the thinking behind it. The Supreme Court ruled, however, like it kind of violated the spirit of the 10th Amendment, and that that the federal government has no business regulating what happens at schools. That's a reserved power to the states. And so kind of, I know that you want to focus on like the facts of the case, like the boy like taking a gun to school. That's irrelevant. What is relevant is that the Supreme Court interpreted that the boy should have been charged under state law, not federal law. I mean, obviously he was still charged and convicted, but the Supreme Court saying he should have been charged under state law. I'll include a description below. Federalism is in the eyes of the beholder, so states' writers, maybe anti-federalists, define federalism as a relationship in which the states retain most of the political power. Nationalists often see the federal government as being supreme in all matters and ultimately in control. So the federal government does give a lot of money to the states. And so states' writers might say, I want the money, but I don't want your restrictions. I don't want your conditions attached to them. Nationalists would say, that believe that the federal government should be very active in our lives, would say that money should come with restrictions. And so this is called nationalists favor categorical grants, each with strict provisions from the federal government how it may be spent, and states' writers like block grants. Like block grants are just money and you spend it however you see fit. So here's money allocated to education, you do whatever you want with it. A nationalist would want stricter strings attached. And so we talked about this within the context of like policing, right? And like the federal government not having a lot of authority to actually intervene. So like I said, like, you know, local politics and state politics really does matter. If you really want to see a change in like these police departments, then you better be like paying attention to who your mayor is, who is your state and local representatives. The federal government can do stuff like in the proposals that we saw in the video, I think that the Democrats offered, they were proposing more money to police departments, but they had to like change their behavior, change their training and stuff like that. So the federal government very much has to kind of incentivize state and local governments to change, right? So maybe the whole debate over policing and stuff like that and reform itself may not be very effective through the federal government. It might be more effective through state and local governments. So keeping with this idea and theme. Then I wrote a thesis statement. All right, I'm done talking. Is that all I wanted to talk about? All right.